Well, I've gotten a lot of emails and comments regarding plywood. What kind of plywood do I use and where do I buy it? And right off the bat, I'll tell you, I don't buy 3/4 inch birch plywood at the home store. And that's because their quality is just not up to par. And a good indication of that is a piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood at your home store is right around $40. And when I first got into woodworking more than 20 years ago, a sheet of 3/4 inch birch plywood was right around $40. So what's happened is they've kept the price the same at your home store, but the quality has just gone way downhill. So I go to a lumber yard. Specifically, I usually go to a place called Blaisdell Lumber, and I just call Jerry up whenever I need a sheet of plywood, whether that's birch plywood, cherry plywood, or Baltic birch plywood, which is sold in a 5x5 foot sheet. The plywood that I get from Blaisdell Lumber generally comes from the United States or Canada, and the price is right around $60 for a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch birch plywood. I'll bring the camera over and we'll take a closer look at the veneer and the core of the plywood. The first piece we're going to look at is a piece of domestic birch plywood. It's got a nice veneer and the core is very uniform. It's made up of 5 plies with a veneer on each side, an A side and a B side. The B side may have a few imperfections that have been repaired, but the A side is generally free of imperfections. Now we're looking at a piece of Baltic birch plywood. It's sold in 5x5 foot sheets, and the big difference here is in the core. This is a piece of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. The thickness is made up with 13 veneers. It's a really good plywood for drawers and plywood furniture. I made a ping pong table using 2 pieces of 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. This is a piece of cherry plywood, and it has a similar core to the birch plywood that we looked at earlier. Now that was a closer look at the birch plywood that you'll find at your lumber yard for around $60 a sheet. Now as far as the Baltic birch plywood, that's generally a special order. You'll have to call your lumber yard, and I don't really remember what the price is. It is a little pricey. It's been a while since I bought that, but remember that's sold in a 5x5 foot sheet. Now as far as the cherry plywood, that's also going to be pricey. You have to expect that with cherry plywood. And now we can take a closer look at the birch plywood that you'll find at most of your home stores. Now right away you can see we have a delamination problem, and it's a paper thin veneer. And sometimes when you tap on the plywood you can hear that there's a void in the plywood. And now we're taking a closer look at the core of the plywood, and you can see that there's nothing pretty about it. And all of these imperfections in the core of the plywood have a likelihood of showing up on the surface, whether that's a delamination or even a break in the plywood. Another sheet stock that I like to use when I'm painting a project is MDF, medium density fiberboard. And MDF it paints up really nice. The only time I won't use it is if it needs to be structural. So for instance, with the lid to the blanket chest, since the lid is being held on with 6 screws, 3 in each hinge, the plywood will hold those screws, where the MDF, I think the screws would rip out of the top before too long. So MDF is definitely a good choice if you're painting a project, but just not structural. And I'll probably use a piece of MDF in the headboard that I'll be making in the next couple of weeks. Now I've got nothing against home stores, and in fact I think it would be great if a home store would put a sign up that says this piece of plywood here is $60 because it's made well and it's not going to fall apart on you, and this piece of plywood over here is $40 and you can expect to have all kinds of problems with your project. That's like truth in advertising. So I think if the home store had those 2 bins of plywood with the descriptions, the consumer would spend the extra $20, because when you think about it, the time that you put into woodworking, that extra $20 isn't going to make that big of a difference. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope I answered some of your questions. Thanks for tuning in.